Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. As the controversy over forming a government in Delhi grows bigger and murkier, we examine what lies behind it. Is a government possible without horse trading? And where do the three parties really stand on this critical issue? That's the big debate in part 2. But first, just how worrying is last week's Al-Qaeda video threatening jihad in the subcontinent and targeting Kashmir, Gujarat, Assam and Ahmedabad by name? Is it a direct threat to India or a response to the way ISIS has overshadowed Al-Qaeda and diminished its credibility? In part 1, I shall interview the man they consider the world's greatest authority on Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And now joining me from Madrid, where he is at the moment, is the author of Taliban, Descent into Chaos and Jihad, the Rise of Militant Islam, Ahmad Rashid. Ahmad Rashid, on Thursday, Al-Qaeda released a 55-minute video of Ayman al-Zawahiri announcing the creation of Al-Qaeda in the subcontinent, promising to spread Islamic rule and raise the flag of jihad. They also targeted by name Assam, Kashmir, Gujarat and Ahmedabad. Do you see this primarily as a direct threat to India, which at one level it must be, or do you primarily see it as a response to the way ISIS has captured large swathes of territory in Iraq and Syria and overshadowed Al-Qaeda?
Frankly, I think it's a bit of a joke. Al-Qaeda has existed in the Indian subcontinent even before 9/11, since 1996, in fact. What we've seen other militant groups carrying out horrendous terrorist attacks like Mumbai, but we have not seen Al-Qaeda being able to do anything like that. So first of all, I think, yes, there is a threat. There's always a threat, and there are many terrorist groups certainly active in India, as there are in Pakistan. But I really don't think that Al-Qaeda can pose a threat to India in any meaningful way. And I do believe that Al-Qaeda must be very worried, because not only has ISIS overshadowed them, but ISIS has also occupying huge areas of territory in Syria, in Iraq, which Al-Qaeda would have wanted to do itself.
Okay.
And it is no longer able to do that now.
You said two very important things, and I want to pick you up on both of them. First, you said that Al-Qaeda cannot pose a serious threat to India, but you also said that Al-Qaeda must be very worried about the way in which ISIS has overshadowed them. Let me take that second point first. Today, Reuters has reported that a splinter group of the Pakistan Taliban called Jamaat-ul-Ahrar and its leader, Ehsanullah Ehsan, have pledged to support ISIS. Separately in India, perhaps as many as 10, by some counts 12 Muslims are said to have either joined ISIS or been stopped just before they did. To what extent do you think Al-Qaeda will be responding to that sort of development and the fact that ISIS is beginning to reach deeper into the subcontinent than Al-Qaeda has ever managed?
I think that Al-Qaeda would like to respond to that in a meaningful way by carrying out a major terrorist attack, but I don't think they have the capacity or the capability. Remember, Al-Qaeda has suffered enormous losses in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. It doesn't have that kind of clout that it used to. Now, where Al-Qaeda still has some loyalty is amongst Pakistani extremist groups who've been sheltering Al-Qaeda, providing safe houses to Al-Qaeda, looking after Al-Qaeda while they've been in Pakistan, including Ayman al-Zawahiri. And it is possible that Pakistani groups may try and carry out terrorist attacks, but it would not be Al-Qaeda doing so. And I think certainly what we are going to see in the months ahead is more and more Indian Muslims and Pakistanis going off to fight for ISIS. Already I consider that if you look at the tactics, the military tactics that ISIS is using, a lot of it is to do with what the Taliban were doing in Afghanistan in the mid-90s before the Americans came, and even the kind of tactics that the Taliban are using today. So there does seem to me to be a lot of Taliban influence on ISIS itself.
Now, one of the things Zawahiri said in that video was he was talking directly to Indian Muslims and he promised, as he put it, to rescue them from injustice, oppression, persecution and suffering. Do you believe that Al-Qaeda, using that language, through that video in general, is making a direct pitch to recruit Indian Muslims to Al-Qaeda's ranks? And is that one of the great fears India should guard against?
Well, you know, I mean, that kind of language is like 20 years old. It's completely out of date with what is going on now. If you look at the kind of very sophisticated propaganda that a lot of these militant groups, including ISIS, are using, to use language like that and to start hectoring and lecturing what Indian Muslims should or should not be doing, you know, I think demonstrates how out of touch Al-Qaeda is, you know, with the new media, with the new realities, and with the new very sophisticated groups that are emerging.
In which case, as someone who has studied and followed Al-Qaeda and perhaps is, as I said in my introduction, the world's greatest authority on the subject, how clearly and how directly a threat does that video and Al-Qaeda's broader intentions pose to India? What would be your studied assessment of that level of threat?
Look, I think one of the reasons Al-Qaeda has made such a statement at this time is to try and gather some support in Pakistan also amongst the extremist groups, the right-wing groups who are opposed to the government in Pakistan and even to the military. Remember that the military right now is carrying out its first very hard-hitting campaign against the Pakistani Taliban for many years. So the fact that, you know, Al-Qaeda is basically telling militants in Pakistan that we are with you, we're your ally, we'll help you, and not only that, but we'll attempt at some kind of legitimacy, if you like, by attacking your old enemy India and by trying to create an Al-Qaeda in India. So I think, you know, Al-Qaeda here is playing a game in order to enlist the sympathy and support of those few Pakistanis who are still playing the terrorist game in Pakistan. On the other hand, I do think India has to take the threat seriously. There's no doubt about it, because there are many splinters who would want to try and demonstrate that they can carry out terrorist attacks in India.
But you are also suggesting that in the first instance, this is perhaps a bigger threat to Pakistan because of Al-Qaeda's capacity to work through a variety of splinter groups in Pakistan. And although it's a threat to India, it's a lower order threat to India.
Yes, definitely. You know, Al-Qaeda has proved to be a huge threat to Pakistan. It has enlisted many Pakistanis and Pakistani groups. Its ability to survive for so many years, we should remember, you know, is because it has internal support from Pakistani militants. And if Ayman al-Zawahiri is up right now in the tribal areas bordering Afghanistan, he will have a lot of support there from the Pakistani Taliban.
Okay.
So I think, you know, the threat certainly is there, but it should not be taken, I would take an ISIS threat much, much more seriously.
Now, Zawahiri in that video announced two Pakistanis, Asim Umar as the head of Al-Qaeda in the subcontinent and Osama Mahmood as the spokesperson. Can you tell us something about who these two are?
Well, frankly, I can't tell you very much, because not very much is known about these two. And I think that's part of the problem with Al-Qaeda, that they really don't have anybody of standing, or if they did have people of standing in Pakistan, people who had some kind of, if you like, terrorist legitimacy, they are either dead or they're in Guantanamo. And I think at the moment Al-Qaeda is really short-staffed of the kind of leadership that would be required to revive Al-Qaeda's prospects in either Pakistan or in India.
Now, beyond Asim Umar and Osama Mahmood, Al-Qaeda in the subcontinent, according to that Zawahiri video, will be under the overall command of Taliban leader Mullah Omar, who is believed to be in Quetta. Does that suggest two things? Firstly, that Al-Qaeda is really depending upon Taliban contact sources and resources to operate and carry out its threats? And secondly, does it suggest that this new organization, Al-Qaeda in the subcontinent, will in some sense be headquartered somewhere in Pakistan?
Look, I think the Afghan Taliban have done their very best over the last 5 or 6 years to distance themselves from Al-Qaeda. The Afghan Taliban realized that Al-Qaeda was an enormous liability for them even in 2001. And it is certainly a very big liability for them now. Now, there may be some practical, logistical help that Al-Qaeda gives the Taliban and vice versa. But really, we have not seen any kind of statement from Mullah Omar in the last 10 years which would warrant any kind of fear that the Taliban were back in bed with Al-Qaeda. In fact, you've seen just the opposite. You've seen Mullah Omar trying to distance himself from international terrorism, talking about Afghan nationalism and Afghan national liberation struggle against the Americans, talking very much in nationalist Afghan terms rather than pan-internationalist terrorist terms.
Now, writing recently in the Daily Beast, Bruce Riedel says that he believes Al-Qaeda in the subcontinent will seek to link up with the Lashkar-e-Taiba. Do you think that's a credible prognosis?
Well, that has been there all along. I think a lot of, if you look at the arrests of Al-Qaeda in Pakistan in 2001, 2, 3, in the early years, a lot of these arrests of Al-Qaeda leaders were done in safe houses that were provided by a variety of groups, which include the Jamaat-e-Islami, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Harkat-ul-Mujahideen, and groups which were both militant and groups that were not so militant. So at that point in time, Al-Qaeda had certainly penetrated into the religious parties. I don't think that's the case anymore.
In other words, therefore, the likelihood of Al-Qaeda operating through LET or operating in collusion with LET is not a very great likelihood in your eyes.
Well, I certainly hope not. I think it would be incredibly damaging for LET if they wanted to operate in India, to do so through Al-Qaeda, because quite frankly, Al-Qaeda does not appeal to the Kashmiris, it does not appeal to Indian Muslims, it has no or very little base in India, and if LET is operating in India, then I think they'll be doing themselves a huge disservice by trying to enlist the support of Al-Qaeda.
One last question on this issue before I change subjects. As Al-Qaeda struggles to prove its credibility and, more importantly, its potency, and perhaps as it struggles to establish itself in this part of the world, do you expect a spate of violent terrorist attacks, or is that unlikely?
Well, I think we've seen huge terrorist attacks in Pakistan in the recent past, carried out by multiple variety of extremist actors, the anti-Shia Lashkar-e-Jangvi, the Pakistani Taliban, groups in Punjab, groups in Karachi, and unfortunately Pakistan is still beset with enormous acts of terrorism. In Afghanistan, we've seen this summer a major Taliban offensive that is still ongoing. They're trying to retake southern Afghanistan, particularly the provinces of Kandahar and Helmand and Zabul, and they're having quite a bit of luck in doing that. There have been very high casualties amongst the Afghan army. Remember, most of the Americans have now left, and the rest will leave by the end of the year. So yeah, I mean, terrorism is ongoing. We have not seen acts of terrorism recently, at least in India. I hope that stays the case. But given the actions of all these terrorist groups and given the complexities of the politics that runs through them, I think India too should be prepared for anything that could happen.
Let's turn to what's happening in Pakistan. Imran Khan and Tahirul Qadri's protests in Islamabad, which began on the 14th of August, have now lasted for over 25 days, and both men insist that they will not call it off until Nawaz Sharif resigns. Nawaz Sharif, on the other hand, has repeatedly said he has no intention of resigning, and Parliament has fully committed itself to supporting him. So first of all, how do you assess the situation? Where is it heading?
Well, it's a real mess. It's a real disgrace, I think. I mean, the point, both sides are at fault, but essentially whether you like Nawaz Sharif or not, he is an elected prime minister. Pakistan has been desperately keen to try and promote the continuation of democracy, not have the military step in. The actions taken by Imran Khan and Tahir al-Qadri have tried very hard to bring the military back in as some kind of player or umpire or even arbiter, which would be extremely dangerous for democracy. And so I think Imran and Tahir al-Qadri are playing a very dangerous game, and we've seen their support has fallen dramatically with the recent meeting in Parliament with the entire opposition, every opposition parties, including the Islamic parties, all supporting Nawaz Sharif and condemning Imran. On the other hand, Nawaz has done very little in the past year to satisfy people's demands. And certainly one of those demands by Imran, which was very rightful, was looking at constituencies that may have been rigged in last year's election. Except that the fallacy for this is that Imran should have done this a year ago. He should not have waited a year before he launched a movement against the government. But there's no question that people are very fed up with the economic crisis, the lack of electricity, the lack of actionable benefits that the Sharif government has been able to provide so far. It's doing a lot of very highfalutin projects which don't have very much relevance to ordinary people.
Two quick questions on the army. What is your assessment of the army's role? Is it behind the protests, as many have alleged, or is it neutral, as the army itself claims?
No, I think first of all, I don't think the army has any interest in coming into power. Certainly the army had developed acute differences with Nawaz Sharif over the last year, over several issues, one of which was in fact peace with India. The other was the fate of General Musharraf, the former president, and the third was the fighting or not fighting the Pakistani Taliban. Now, clearly, I mean, a lot of people see Imran and Tahir al-Qadri as having moved according to the military's agenda. I think that's really a bit far-fetched. I think certainly the military would like to see pressure on Nawaz Sharif so that he listens more to what other actors such as the army are saying.
Okay.
But I certainly don't think that with the mess that exists in Pakistan right now, the army is in any position or desirous of wanting to take over.
Does that mean that in fact you don't believe an army takeover is likely, and that with every passing day it becomes more unlikely in fact?
Yes, I mean, if you look now after this protest, with the economy much worse than it is, the electricity, everything is worsened in a much worse way. We've had to call off the visit of the Chinese president, which was a huge blow not only to the government but to the army itself. So if the army had wanted to resolve this, if for nothing else than to make sure that the Chinese president arrives in Pakistan, the army would have acted some time ago, but it hasn't.
Even if Nawaz Sharif survives this crisis, as perhaps now looks likely he will, would you accept that he's going to emerge the other side a very weakened prime minister? And secondly, would you also accept that this is a very damaging blow to Pakistan's fledgling democracy, that the enormous pride the country took last year in its first successful transition from one civilian government to another, that pride has been dented?
Yeah, I would agree with all that you said. He will certainly emerge as a very weakened prime minister. Will this bump in the road, will this actually convince him to change his cabinet, to bring in some fresh people, to carry out some fresh thinking and be more active as a prime minister? He's been very laid back as a prime minister and not taking up the kind of day-to-day issues that people expected him to do. And certainly I think, you know, he will appear much weakened than before. And this is really going to weaken in the long term Pakistan democracy and civilian dominance, if you like, over the military, which has been a long time aim of many of the civilian parties. The army will remain the arbiter, especially of foreign policy.
Okay.
And things are not going to get very much better.
Looking further west at Afghanistan, The presidential elections there were supposed to produce a clear result in a new government, and it seems all they've done is to create controversy and instability. How do you see that messy situation playing out over the next few weeks and months?
Well, the Americans are trying very hard now for a coalition government. In other words, to bring the two candidates, Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah together into one government. It may work for a few weeks or a few months. I don't think in the long term it's going to work. And I think what they should be gearing at is, I think President Karzai should resign now, and it would be really by resigning he would force the decisions of these two to come to an agreement to stick together. A great concern, of course, is that if this squabble is not worked out, then the money that is due to Afghanistan to sustain the army and the economy and the country is not going to be forthcoming, either from the Americans or the Europeans or anywhere else.
So in addition,
that is going to result possibly in a much bigger crisis and a great success for the Taliban.
So in addition to political instability, Afghanistan is also staring at financial bankruptcy.
That's true. Afghanistan already, I mean, I've been talking to Afghans. There are some Afghan militia soldiers who have not received their salaries for 5 months. Certainly there are bureaucrats now in Kabul who have not received their salaries for 1 month. And if this crisis continues, you can see the enormous dependency that the Afghans have on Western aid, that if the Afghan government doesn't have money for salaries, leave alone trying to fight a war with the Taliban.
Now, as you said a little earlier, American troop levels in January in Afghanistan will be down to just about 10,000, possibly by 2016 or 17, they could be down to 0. Many in India fear that when that happens, the Taliban could begin to occupy large parts of Afghanistan. Do you share that concern, or is it a bit exaggerated in your eyes?
Well, I do share the concern that certainly the South is going to be relatively easier for them to establish control, at least in the countryside. I don't think they're going to be able to take major cities in the South like Kandahar, but certainly in the countryside they will be successful. That is their heartland, that's where they come from, and that's where they've always been based. So, and then it's going to depend on the new government to really establish some kind of dialogue with the Taliban. There's been a lot of talk about reconciliation with the Taliban. What is needed is now a political dialogue by the new president or the new duo act which will come into power, and the Taliban, helped by the international community. I think there are a lot of Taliban, including some of the leaders, who want an end to the fighting and want a peaceful resolution.
But then doesn't this mean that the crisis in government formation, the fact that the two contestants are actually quarreling with each other, the fact that a coalition doesn't look likely, or even if it's formed, as you said, it won't last for long, doesn't that make the whole situation a lot worse?
It does. It does. There has to be political stability. I think the biggest mistake the Americans made in leaving so early, specifically in this year, they should have waited another year. The biggest mistake they made was they failed to see through the political transition. And by doing so, they've plunged the whole country, the whole region, into potential chaos. And the international community should have stayed in with their troops this year. They should have used those troops as clout, political clout and military clout, to force a result of these elections and to make sure that they were held in a free and fair manner.
Now,
by pulling out so quickly, they've...
Sorry, carry on.
Sorry.
I was going to say...
So by pulling out so quickly, they've done a huge disservice to themselves and to the Afghans.
There is a view in India, Ahmad Rashid, that the turmoil in Pakistan, the mess in Afghanistan, and now the latest Al-Qaeda threat suggests a sharply deteriorating security environment with the potential for things to get considerably worse. Do you agree with that view, or do you think it's a bit needlessly bleak?
No, I do agree with that view, and especially with the advent of ISIS in the Middle East. I mean, that the whole the region of Pakistan, Afghanistan, Central Asia becomes much, much worse. You know, there's no question now that there is a war within Islam. This is not a war between the West and Islam so much as a war within Islam. A war by Sunni extremists trying to wipe out the Shia minority and all other minorities. And this poses a huge new danger to South Asia as well as anywhere else. And secondly, of course, the instability in both these countries is really pointing towards, unfortunately, even greater chaos.
I want very quickly, in the limited time left to us, to talk a little about what you just said, the war within Islam. First of all, ISIS. How far south into Iraq can their control spread? I know they want to attack Karbala and Najaf, but do you think it's at all possible that they could succeed? Because that could then lead to Muslim civil war.
You see, they are using a multi-pronged strategy. They're on the border with Lebanon. They've been killing Lebanese soldiers. They're on the border with Jordan. They're trying to attack Jordanian posts on the border. And of course, they are occupying parts of Syria and parts of Iraq. And they have threatened also to expand into the Gulf states and into Saudi Arabia. Remember, they share a border with Saudi Arabia also. So, you know, this is a movement that is extremely dangerous, and its geostrategic positioning in the middle of the Middle East does give it a huge advantage, especially when we see the vulnerability and the collapse of two major Middle Eastern states like Iraq and Syria. Without a proper political government in either state, ISIS is going to do, you know, very well. And the second part of this is the horrendous campaign against minorities, which is, and that includes Muslim minorities as well as non-Muslim minorities. The attacks against the Yazdis, the Christians, the Turkmens, as well as the general attack against the Shias that is taking place. This is unheard of, unparalleled in Muslim history. And the region as a whole is going to suffer enormously as a result of this.
As you said, ISIS is a threat to the Middle East as we know it, not just to the countries that immediately surround its present borders, but right across that critical geostrategic region. Is there a credible response from these countries to the challenge they're facing? Or do you have the feeling that they're unable, for whatever reason, to rise to the challenge?
Well, you know, I think Obama's made it very clear that they're not going to be American troops helping these countries resolve their problems. But these countries, I mean, if you look at the Gulf states, they're enormously well armed. They've got huge air forces. They've got the latest in technology and all the rest. Jordan has a very well equipped army. And even if the Iraqi army is very weak and splintered, and the Syrian army is fighting its own civil war, you do have capacity there, but it needs political leadership and political mobilization. And that's where both, at the moment, the Arabs are lacking and the Americans are lacking. There is no leadership in that region.
Very, very quickly, Ahmad Rashid, because we have only 20 seconds left before we lose the satellite connection to Madrid. Obama is going to announce on Wednesday his strategy in response to the ISIS threat. What would you advise him to do? But you have to give me a short answer.
I think the main thing is a major political initiative with, to bring the Arab states together into an alliance against ISIS. And this means not John Kerry dropping in for a few hours a day. It means John Kerry and a group of American diplomats literally living in the Middle East for several weeks before some kind of alliance is put together.
Ahmad Rashid, thank you very much for agreeing to give us this interview. A pleasure talking to you, and I'm sorry if we kept you standing in the hot Madrid sun.